Hi, everybody. Welcome to Cruising the Caribbean and Bahamas. My name is Jessica Grimm. I'm the sailing specialist with Navionics. Navionics provides electronic charts for oceans, lakes, rivers, all kinds of waterways. Today, our webinar will be recorded. It will be available on the Navionics website and the Navionics YouTube afterward, and you will also get a follow-up email that will give you the link to that recording. The PDF will also be available on the on the Navionics website. So you'll be able to see all of this information again for reference. To maintain sound quality, everyone is muted. Please remain muted, and we will keep you muted from the admin side as well. Please, if you have questions, use the Q&A section of your webinar, GoToWebinar portal. That will allow questions to come through to us. And I will try to answer any questions in the QA if possible, and then we will answer questions at the end of the webinar if we have time. If not, we'll answer any of your questions via email afterward. And moving on to introducing the webinar hosts, we have Ed Tillett with Waterway Guide. And he is a sailor, fisherman, and author. He's been in the business many, many years. Ed is an absolute expert on everything water, so he's absolutely amazing. Matt and Lucy Claiborne, they are Bahamas cruising editors for Waterway Guide. Both of them have their captain's licenses for over 15 years, and they are live aboards. And we have Mark, who is the editor and publisher of the annual Wagoner Magazine Guide and co-author of Cruising the Virgin Islands. And Mark has lots and lots of experience in the Virgin Islands, and he'll be giving us more of a charter perspective, and Matt and Lucy will be giving us more of a live aboard perspective. Thank you so much to our sponsors. We can all turn off our webcams now so that everyone can have a full view. We have Smart Plug as a sponsor, Cutwater, On Spot Wi-Fi, and Ranger Tugs. All of these are amazing sponsors. They've done a lot of work for us getting this webinar together, and Waterway Guide, of course, has done so much work on this. Thank you so much, and thanks to Navionics for hosting this webinar. Moving on and passing everything over to Ed for now.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, this is our agenda tonight. We've got a lot of information we're going to cover. We've assembled some really great folks tonight. You heard with Jessica's introductions a moment ago. They're great on the water cruising editors, adventurers. They've traveled the world, and they're going to be feeding us this information all night long. We won't take time away from this session really to regale you with the credentials of everyone who's here. It should be evident as they present in the coming hour. We have to make some assumptions that you're attending this webinar because you either plan to take your own vessel to the Bahamas or the Caribbean or crew on one, or maybe you plan to charter one once there. Either way, the advice and the information that we're going to present should be relevant to your plans. We have a lot of information to cover, a short amount of time to get it all in. As you know, you can chat questions to Jessica. She'll be answering questions and feeding answers back to you. And we're going to move quickly through this information tonight. You can always revisit the webinar and download the material for follow-on reference from the Navionics archive site. It will be posted there in the days ahead. Jessica also has experience cruising both Bahamas and the Caribbean. Matt and Lucy are spending most of their cruising time in the Bahamas. Mark Bunzel will focus on the Virgin Islands. And so let's get started. Mark, I believe you've got kind of an update on the weather and the situation from last year's storms through the Virgin Islands. So turning it over to you.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, as many of you may recall, it was just a little over a year ago, September of last year, that Hurricane Irma and Marie plowed through the Virgin Islands. Here are two pictures that just giving you a sense of the devastation. Over 600 out of the 900 boats were destroyed. And part of what you're going to be hearing tonight is that the Virgin Islands has come back. Come back at least for chartering and for sailing in the area. We'll talk about the beach bars that are available, some of the resorts. Now, resorts like the Bitter End are completely destroyed, but restaurants and others are open for business, and it was just much easier for the economy of the Virgin Islands for them to get the charter business up and running because it wasn't dependent upon the infrastructure on land. And the people did just a super job, and it really looks great.
All right, thanks, Mark. Jessica, are you online? Are you going to take this one and fill us in on some of the details about updating and syncing your chart plotters?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the options with Navionics is to do a syncing of your chart with your plotter and through your phone or iPad. You can do this with Raymarine, Lorient, Simrad, B&G plotters. You can transfer routes, markers, and update charts. You can do this with your Navionics app on your phone or your tablet for backup. So you can do all of this from your salon without having to actually go up to your chart plotter, and then you have everything ready to go for your navigation the next day.
Okay, great. Moving on, we're going to bring in Matt and Lucy Claiborne now, based on their experience cruising the Bahamas, and they've got some advice. So Matt, turning it over to you, and Mark as well, if you've got something to add.
Sure, this is Matt, and for those of us who have navigated in the islands, we realize pretty quickly that navigating there is a little different than navigating over here in the States. For one thing, there's really no markers on anything. A lot of major channels don't have buoys or atons at all. Not even major shoals or rocks have atons. So you really have to keep your eyes open all the time, constantly compare what's in front of you, and compare that with what you expect to see. It's best to have a variety of resources to pull from, and always keep a proper lookout at all times. The sandbanks shift all the time, especially when major storms come through. And remember, there's no funding for government surveys to update things. So we really have to use a lot of different sources and always research.
And Mark, what's your experience in the Virgin Islands with navigation and the charts that you're using there?
Well, very similar to what Matt described, in that you have to realize that if a buoy is on your charts and not where you expect it to be, it's gone away, and who knows when it's going to come back. And you now have to look around and say, okay, what other, whether it's a land feature or a buoy on the other side of the channel, can I use to determine where I am? Also, reading the water. Luckily, that water is just gorgeous, blue, beautiful water. And but when it starts to get closer to white, that's not good. And when you go into places like Anegada, which is a reef, basically, you really need to read the water on your way in to make sure you stay away from areas where you could get into trouble.
Hey, Matt, you made an interesting note on this slide down on the lower left corner. This was interesting to me. Explain that if you would, please.
Sure. The charts in the Bahamas and in all the islands have recommended routes published, and all of the different chart manufacturers have their own routes, but they wind up being extraordinarily similar. So on busy, crowded weekends, you're going to find an awful lot of boats on those routes. It's not a bad idea to plan your trip to be just a couple, maybe a half mile or a mile further into deeper water, into safer water, and keep a proper lookout, because there will be a lot of boats crowding those waterways.
And here was another recommendation you made as well.
Sure. A lot of chart plotters now have auto routing functionality, which really isn't a great option in the Bahamas. You got to double check your resources. You're not really sure current status of shoals and that sort of thing. So you have to be pretty careful with the auto routing and just back it up. Make sure that it's doing the right thing.
Would you concur with that in the Caribbean, Mark?
Absolutely. The soundings and you know, it's not like what we have in the States and Canada, where they regularly go back to some of these areas. And then Nigel Calder, in his book, How to Read a Navigational Chart, points out that he hit coral reef at times because the reef continues to grow. And when a sounding hasn't been done, or an area sounded in 40 years, all of a sudden you could have a reef, and it's the water may be a foot less or even more less than what's shown on the charts. So you really want to be careful about that. It's not like Kansas.
Good point. Well, that pretty much wraps up navigation. I think we've covered everything that we plan to when it comes to navigation preparation, syncing up, using different resources. And I guess Matt, Lucy, Mark, with your experiences there, and Jessica as well, she's probably busy answering some question right now. I think the multiple resources is the key. Don't rely on a single source, and research, and pay attention. Let's move on to preparation. I love this line. Matt, you've got it.
Sure. So our number one advice for new cruisers going over to the islands is to not have a schedule. You think you're going to plan your trip based on where you want to visit and when you want to visit there, but it winds up more often than not being based on the weather. So for us, we've been stuck in places for weeks at a time, and a lot of people focus on that one big jump across the Gulf Stream when they think they're there. But in actuality, there's several big jumps to get over to the Exumas, cross the Gulf Stream, cross the banks, cross Exuma Sound, etc.
So the idea is don't have a schedule. Now, how does that, I guess we can move on next, because your recommendation was if you don't have a long time, consider a charter.
Absolutely. This is Lucy. So if you have a short vacation from work planned and you only have 2 weeks off of work and you've got a tight schedule, I'd definitely consider a charter. That way you can fly in, charter a gorgeous boat, and focus on your vacation time instead of experiencing pressure from weather and your work schedule. There's a lot of great chartering options in the Bahamas. We recommend the Abacos or the Exumas as great chartering destinations.
Okay, I heard the Exumas. You're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if you need to get closer to the mic. It may be mine, but you said the Abacos and Exumas. Was that your recommendation?
Yeah, absolutely. In the Bahamas, the Abacos and the Exumas are great chartering destinations.
Great, great. All right, Mark, this is obviously one of your photos. Did you take this, or was this on one of your trips?
I did take this, and this is Sandy Key. It was near Joost van Dyke. It was donated by the Rockefeller family, and it's a great day stop. You can swim, walk on the beach there. But tied to selecting and setting up in your preparation, choosing your charter company and the type of boat is really critical, and it's one of the first decisions you make. Unlike Matt and Lucy, on a charter, though, typically you have a week, 10 days, or 2 weeks, and it never seems to be enough. So the preparation and laying out where you want to go, and then looking at all the different things you can do, and then matching that to your crew and your trip plans can be a great way to start out with the preparation. Now with the fleets in the Virgin Islands, you now have a choice between power and charter, power and sail, and some really great options in the 900 or so boats that are typically down there. So with the type of trip is choosing what destinations you really want to see. And almost everybody wants to see the baths, which is that middle picture where you can walk in that crystal clear blue water and just amongst the giant boulders. The Indians is an excellent day stop to do snorkeling. The caves at Norman Island, Anegada, which is an open ocean crossing, 14 miles to get out to the island of Anegada, and need to be part of your plan. Sandy Key, which was in the previous slide, and Joost van Dyke. And then if you have 10 days to 2 weeks, you might want to go into the USVI and then see some of the great beaches at the US Virgin Islands. Often when I'm helping people set up their trip, I start to ask the question, well, what do you want to do in the Virgin Islands? And you can do this in the Bahamas also. Do you want beach bars and restaurants, or do you want remote destinations that you can go to and possibly be the only boat there and just really enjoy it? And in most cases, people want to mix up a little bit of both. The other thing is, what type of activities do you want to set up? Scuba diving, snorkeling, small boat sailing. So scuba diving, you can actually set up with some of the dive operators in the Virgin Islands, and they will send their dive boat out, meet your boat at its anchorage, and they call them rendezvous dives, and then take you to a dive location. Great snorkeling locations. We talked about the baths and the Indians already. And then small boat sailing, the bitter end, and they're going to be reopening their boating center this upcoming summer. But they have an excellent fleet of small boats where you can go sailing in Gorda Sound in a Hobie surf runner or a laser or some other boat. Now, people say, well, if I'm boating, why do I want to rent a boat? Well, the sailing can really be a lot of fun with the trade winds. You want to decide what gear do you take and what do you want to rent or ask to have equipped on the boat. I like to recommend that people take their snorkels, because snorkel is something you want to have that matches perfectly. And sometimes the snorkels available from the charter companies, the masks available, don't fit quite right. And it can just be a real pain when you're trying to adjust your mask and keep it from leaking.
So you say take your own mask and snorkel, or definitely take your own mask?
Snorkel doesn't take much space. Definitely take your own mask. Some people even have masks with prescription lenses built in. But things like flippers, and you're better off using what's on the boat. And I recommend also considering, as you can see in this picture, a shorty wetsuit. The water's warm, but a shorty wetsuit will just give you just a little extra warmth.
Great. Okay, so this next slide is Matt and Lucy's recommendation, and I thought this one was really good. Explain this if you would.
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, we've been stuck, and I say stuck in air quotes because it's not always an unpleasant thing, in certain locations for more than 15 days when cold fronts come through. So even though we're further south, we still get cold fronts in the Bahamas. It doesn't get cold like it does up north, but we get strong winds and chop that can make some of the cuts between islands unsafe. So you wind up somewhere for weeks at a time, and you really get to meet the locals and enjoy the place. So you might as well pick someplace that you really want to be and someplace that's fun.
Okay, great. I just got a note from one of my team that said my audio is not sounding too good. Can you hear me pretty well on the far side, or is my audio causing some problems? Over.
We can hear you just fine, Ed.
All right, good enough. All right, we're still in preparation, and now we come to that important part. We've talked about navigation. What kind of trip are you going to go on? Now, how do you mind the weather? How do you prepare, and how do you keep an eye on things? So I'm going to turn this over to you, Matt and Lucy.
Yeah, so we've obviously already been talking a lot about the weather, and our number one recommendation for cruising the Bahamas on your own boat, without a schedule, hopefully, is to listen to Chris Parker. He's really mastered what we're doing out there. He's a cruiser himself, and his forecasts are conservative, but they're usually spot on. Nothing else really provides an interpretation of the weather over there. And you can get his broadcasts on single sideband radio. You can talk to him over two-way with a subscription, or you can just receive him. We've successfully received him with a $100 or so receiver. It doesn't always work, it's not great, but it will pick him up in most of the islands.
I'll just add that in the Virgin Islands, first of all, the Virgin Islands cruising area is not very big considering the number of boats. So look at it as 35 miles by 12 miles. So often you're picking up your weather, you've got an internet connection, you can see what's going there. So it's very different than than the Bahamas, where you have such a big range of islands and area where you've got weather to come in. But still, you want to be aware. I've been down there where people knocked on the boat and said, oh, by the way, there's a hurricane heading our way, but it won't be here for 4 days. So typically the extreme weather, you have plenty of advance notice and everybody helps each other out. The biggest consideration with weather is if you're going out on the open ocean and headed offshore to Anegada. And there's a situation where you want to be checking out what's happening with the swell and the winds from the Atlantic Ocean coming in that way, and being prepared, just like Matt and Lucy would be in the Bahamas, to say maybe today is a day that I don't want to go, and save it for another day.
Okay, thanks, Mark. This is Lucy. So in the Bahamas, a great way to get weather data is through your cell phone. In the Bahamas, they have excellent LTE cell service, and you can pick that up anywhere near a settlement. LTE service in the Bahamas is amazing. It's actually faster and cheaper than in the United States, and you can pay as you go with either BTC or Alive. They are two separate cell phone companies in the Bahamas, and they each have their own towers. When you have your cell phone set up to receive data, you can use all your apps for weather, receive emails, receive Chris Parker's webcasts, and do all the surfing and streaming you like, just like you are in America. It's amazing. If you don't want to pick up a Bahamian cell phone plan, you can use T-Mobile International, and they do international roaming. International roaming is very slow. It's more like dial-up days, but it will be usable for email. Just remember, as you're cruising the Bahamas, your cell data won't work on long passages. It will only work when you're in view of that cell tower. It's usually about 8 miles.
Once you do have data on your phone, you can use any app that you use back home. All of these apps give you raw weather forecast model data, but it's up to you to interpret it.
I'd like to jump in here real quick, Matt. I've put in this slide for anyone who happens to download this presentation later, a link to what is called a weather app shootout. We did a 4-part series at Waterway Guide by one of our cruising editors, Bob Shearer, who did about a 6-month assessment of many weather apps, and I can't remember how many he did, but he went through and took them apart piece by piece and graded them and checked them out and assessed which ones gave him the right information at the right time. It's a fascinating 4-part series. If you download this presentation and you click on this link, it will take you to the first story in waterwayguide.com in our news and events archive repository, and you can search in there for all of Bob's comments. We got a lot of reviews and comments from folks who read it, who rang in on it and said this was their experience, that was experience, et cetera. But Matt and I talked the other day, and you said, Matt, most of these weather apps are working fine as long as you have cell service and a decent GPS signal in the Bahamas. Is that correct? And in the Virgin Islands, Mark?
Absolutely. They're all downloading global weather models. So they're all working equally well over in the islands. The only difference is you don't have a government entity like NOAA, National Weather Service, interpreting it for you.
Gotcha. Hey, how about okay, go ahead.
The only thing I'll add to that is that they are weather models, and they're computer generated, and we've found in different areas that we're cruising, sometimes the weather models are off, and sometimes eyeballs and weather reports, and if you can get lighthouse reports for an area, you'll get a much better forecast.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. We went ahead and put this Iridium Go in here. Matt, if you would, how about bringing us up to speed on this?
Sure, this is the last option we've got here for getting your weather when you're in the islands. The good thing about satellite communication is that it works absolutely anywhere. So if you're going on long passages, if you're doing the rallies like the Salty Dog or the Caribbean 1500, something like this is really handy if your boat doesn't have an SSB. We had it for a couple years and we wound up canceling it simply because it is very expensive. And like Lucy said earlier, the cell phone signals in the Bahamas are excellent. So these are really handy if you're going offshore. Just keep in mind they're very slow and it's really email or text only.
All right, I get to ring in on this one. Some of you cruisers may know Hank Pomerantz, former weather guy with the U.S. Navy. He's giving briefings on the Intracoastal Waterway down in Southport, North Carolina. And Hank and Bob Shearer, one of our cruising editors, and I have had an ongoing discussion about weather planning. And there are a lot of opinions about weather and getting your sources accurate, getting accurate sources, interpreting them. But Matt included this in here, and I thought this was a great recommendation. Learn how to interpret the weather and decipher different model solutions for your own forecasts. You can simply pay for Chris Parker, but the more that you begin looking at weather and looking at the weather that's occurring around you, north, south, east, west, what's happening, what are trends, getting into some of the forecast discussions that NOAA offers when you're in the United States and in other places as you look, you can begin interpreting and getting a sense and then comparing that to what reality is, you'll get a sense of what to expect and not simply depend on what someone is telling you or what some app may be providing you, and either they're behind or their models are off. So the more time you spend learning it, the more accurate and you will have in terms of your forecast and the information that you need. So let's move on to provisioning. So you've figured out what navigation hardware you've got. You know where you're going. You know what you're going to do. You've got a sense that your weather reports are going to be accurate and you're going to be able to do this trip. What are you going to eat, and how are you going to provision your boat? Matt, I love your first line. Or Matt and Lucy, you take this one. Okay, it's time for provisioning. Tell us about this first line, Lucy. Matt?
Sure. Well, the natural inclination is to stock up all the food that you're going to want to eat for the next 6 months. But always remember that they do eat over in the Bahamas and the islands, so you will be able to find food. One of the things we found, you can always find potatoes, onions, and eggs, and they're relatively inexpensive. It's important to plan stops at major hubs, and this is a good spot for you to re-provision. You'll always want to make sure that you have 1 or 2 weeks ahead of time in your stores so that you don't run out. Sometimes you will stop by a grocery store and they just won't have exactly what you're looking for. In the major hubs like Marsh Harbor, Spanish Wells, or Nassau, they do have large grocery stores similar to what you'd find in the United States. Prices will be more expensive, and some items will be up to 2 to 3 times more expensive than the United States. In the out or family islands, they will have less availability, but you can always find something to eat.
And there's a good example of what Matt and Lucy have found. So obviously, Matt, you're a fan of Oreos, but instead of paying $6, you pay $1.25 for some Hill's chocolate biscuits from the UK, eh?
Yeah, it's interesting that American imports seem to be taxed at a higher rate than UK or Canadian imports. We're not actually fans of Oreos. We actually miss the Hill's biscuits when we're back in the United States. They're really good.
Hey, what's your experience in the Virgin Islands and in that part of the Caribbean, Mark? Same thing?
Well, yeah, as Lucy said, there are stores, and people tend to, even when they're going out for a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, they kind of buy out the store, and then they find, well, gee, we want to go to restaurants. And I think the boat cleaning people end up with plenty of food coming off the charter boats at the end of the charter that wasn't consumed. So you can go light, you can find water, but I think first is to start out and think about what kind of cruising you want to do, whether you want to eat at restaurants or cook on board. And if you could go to the next slide. And then we recommend that you pre-order for delivery to the boat a number of things. One more slide, Ed.
Yeah, I'm going to jump to this, but I'm going to back up in a moment. So go ahead and finish up this one. Okay. You're right.
Pre-order some of your things that you're going to want, like water, beer, wine. Have them put it on the boat. In Road Town, which is the principal town in Tortola, there is a superstore, almost like a Costco. It's a locally owned store. So you've got plenty of things that are there. And again, as Lucy said, you really don't need to stock up for the entire trip.
But there are some things I see, Lucy and Matt, that you recommend in the Bahamas on this particular list. Is that correct?
Definitely. There are some things that are very expensive in the Bahamas. Toiletries like deodorant, shampoo, and sunscreens, it's a good idea to stock up before you get to the Bahamas. They're about 2 to 3 times more expensive. Coffee, if you find Folgers coffee, okay, you can find that. But if you're looking for whole coffee beans, it's a good idea to take your whole coffee beans. You can get big propane tanks refilled quite easily, but if you need 1-pound canisters for your grill, you'll want to bring those ahead of time. Specialized pet food is hard to find. They usually sell Alpo in most stores, but it's a good idea to bring your own pet's food with you. And if you're shopping gluten-free or organic, major hubs will be fine for you, but out and family islands will be more difficult to provision in.
I see you've got a recommendation on trash.
Yeah, you want to be always conscious that these islands really don't have dumps. They don't have space for all your trash to bring in. So just be conscientious of that. Some of the out islands will charge you per bag across $5 or more. But remember, nowhere is there recycling, and most of their garbage is burned. So just be conscientious of that and discard your packaging before you leave. Get rid of all your cardboard, all that good stuff.
Great, good recommendation. All right, moving on, and it's pet time.
So each nation that you pass through will have its own animal import requirements. So it's important to check with each country you're traveling to and make sure that you can meet those requirements before you leave the United States. Some islands are more restrictive and require certain tests that can take many, many weeks to get, and they'll have to be approved by certain veterinarians. So make sure you do your research before you leave to do your whole trip. In the Bahamas, importing your pet is fairly easy. You'll want to send your request and fee to Nassau via FedEx, and you can get the reply back via fax. If you don't have a fax number, you can sign up for an online fax number and it will send it to your email. Print that document out and take it to your vet to sign the pet import permit. We like to use a vet in Coconut Grove Animal Hospital. It's near Dinner Key in Miami. They do these pet fees all the time, and it's excellent service. You don't even need an appointment.
Is your doggy vet afraid of the vet? You just said vet and he barked.
Yes, he's concerned that we're talking about him.
Good show. All right, so the next, so we've got pets covered so far. Now let's talk about repairs and maintenance. Matt, Lucy, before we're gonna conduct another drawing here in a moment as soon as we finish this up. But what's your recommendation if you are taking your own vessel? How much self-sufficiency are you practicing?
Well, you want to be as self-sufficient as you can be practically. If you need any consumables like filters, impellers, that sort of thing, you definitely want to have that aboard. It's just too much of a hassle to find it. If you've got space for all the good stuff like alternators and that sort of thing, that's amazing. But if you do need to get parts, there are dealers, there are mechanics in the islands. You can look them up and research them. One recommendation we found, if you do need to get something, always try to source it locally first. If you can buy it from a shop over there, it may be a little more expensive than you pay back home, but you won't have to deal with customs. So you'll probably get it cheaper and faster that way. And even if local means, hey, I'm in Eleuthera and I need the part for the dealers in Nassau, if you can just get them to put it on an airplane to you, local freight like that between islands is pretty quick and pretty cheap.
Great. All right, well, Jessica, if you're available, it's time to pull another drawing. I'm going to explain what a smart plug is. I've been wanting one for my vessel for a couple of years, and I connected up with the guys at the Annapolis Boat Show this year and ended up getting the smart plug inlets and ports. I got so tired of trying to twist my connector and put it in the boat. I think one of the big sailboat manufacturers is using them now. They're coming standard, but Terry Gilliland at Smart Plug donated a really nice inlet and connector. All right, moving on. So we've got repairs and maintenance. So now you're gonna have some friends coming in to see you. So Matt, some good advice here from you and Lucy about getting your friends in and out of the islands and on your boat. What's the story here?
Sure. So before you invite your visitors, think about where they're going to come from and where they're going to leave. Think about what airports you can use, but also think about where you are right now. Don't have guests fly into Nassau if you're very far away. Sometimes it seems like Marsh Harbor is very close, but if you don't have good weather, it can be a problem transiting between the islands. So make sure you think of what airport would be great to use and what your current location is. Also, if you plan to fly home for the holidays, think ahead of what your plan is going to be to get home.
And remember, the major airports and the major hubs in the islands like Marsh Harbor, Nassau, Freeport, sometimes Georgetown. They have direct flights from the US, and that's always going to be the cheapest option. There are local commuter flights that service the out islands like Cat Island and Long Island and Eleuthera, but that's going to be more expensive and more complex to manage. So if you can pick up guests or you can plan to do your own flying out of those major hubs, it makes life a little bit easier. So these slides were prepared talking about taking your own boat and getting it all the way to the BVI if you want to cruise the Caribbean. You've got a couple options to do it. The rallies are a big option that a lot of people like to do, and most of them leave from Chesapeake Bay. One thing to note from these slides is just take notice of how far east these islands are. It's a lot of easting, and that means a lot of beating into the prevailing winds. One option is the delivery skipper favorite, taking I-65, which means to just make easting all the way to 65 degrees of longitude and then do your south with the wind on your beam. Another option, if you prefer to do island hopping, is simply to do day hops, cross the Gulf Stream, go island to island all the way down. It's quite a long road, and it's been known as the Thorny Path for many years. A very famous book covers this, The Gentleman's Guide to Cruising the Islands by Bruce Van Sant, and that talks about how you can use, if you want to jump to the next slide, Ed, that talks about how you can use cold fronts, which will produce southwest, west, and northwest winds to help you out with that easting. And that uses mostly day hops with few overnights. It's also worth noting that the Caribbean's a big place, and you might have other destinations other than BVI that you want to check out in the Caribbean, all the way from Belize, Honduras on the west side, all the way to the Lesser Antilles on the east side. There's multiple ways into the Caribbean Sea. You can go west of Cuba, east of Cuba in the Windward Passage, as described in the Thinking Man's Guide to Voyaging South. And you can also take the Mona Passage between Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico.
So one of the things that happens, and I already mentioned to you that this area that we're looking at on the map is basically 35 miles wide and 12 miles up and down between the heart of the islands, and then about another 14 miles to Anegada if you want to go out that. So you've got an option that you can have a really nice vacation for 7 days. The challenge is, especially if you're coming from the West Coast, is you'll burn up a day before you get there, and it's an overnight flight. So you may want to allow some time to get the boat ready, to check out the boat, do your provisioning before you take off. But with 7 days, you can go in terms of the islands in the core. You see Tortola in the very center. Most of the charter companies are in Tortola. And then you can do a hop just around these islands, and right in that Sir Francis Drake Bay, Sir Francis Drake Channel. Now, if you have a little longer for 10 days, then you can go up to Anegada, and you can add other fill-in locations like Peter Island. And then 14 days, you can go over to the left-hand side there, which is the USVI. And really all you'll want to go to is St. John. St. John's got some beautiful beaches on the north coast, but this is how you can do a nice multi-day trip. The other thing to point out is that, you can go to the next slide, you got it there, never mind, is that most of the navigation is within sight, and you don't always have even a GPS on some of the charter boats that are there. So it's very simple. You can see the direction. For years, they gave you nothing. You are out of sight of land for a little bit when you're going offshore to Anegada. And I've been for years taking my iPad with Navionics and using that to basically navigate and have some very, very good information. So you don't have to do a lot, and you're not going to be doing much in weather in the Virgin Islands.
So slightly unlike the Virgin Islands, when we're cruising south in the Bahamas, we're picking our anchorages nearly always based on the weather. As I previously said, we're worried about cold fronts coming down, and they always bring strong squalls and northwest winds that you need to be protected from. It's easier said than done in a lot of places. can go on to the next slide. In the Abacos, most of the really good anchorages are tucked into the little towns like Hopetown and Man of War, and these are nearly always, they are all full of moorings. We've learned in the Abacos, if we want to hang out in those places and there's a front coming, it's usually easier just to go ahead and pick up one of those moorings. Marsh Harbor is the favorite anchorage in the Abacos, but it's not, they call it all around, but it gets really miserable in west winds. It's very crowded. So it's not an awesome choice, but it's one of the only ones up there. Places like Eleuthera, Cat Island, and Long Island, cruising the west shores of those islands is beautiful, but there are just very few places you can duck into there that will give you protection from west winds. So you have to watch your weather very carefully there. In the Exumas, there's quite a few good anchorages, but they're mostly roadsteads that are only protected from the weather from one direction or the other. So keep that in mind. You're going to have to move around a little bit. Resist the urge to stay put. We see every front that passes through, we see lots of boats sitting out there bouncing around, and oftentimes there's a dangerous rocky lee shore right behind them. The most popular anchorage in the Abacos is Marsh Harbor because everybody convenes there to do all their shopping, fly in, pick up passengers, do repairs. It's a great stop. The moorings in Hopetown and Man of War, I've already mentioned, one of our favorite stops. In the Exumas, people love Big Major spot at Staniel Key in Georgetown. Georgetown has a lot of spots, and we always recommend if you get away from town just a little bit, you can find quiet little places. There's beautiful nature trails and hiking you can do. It's a really cool spot.
Every place in the Bahamas is our favorite, so it's very hard to choose a favorite spot. But we do love the Abacos, especially Green Turtle Key and Hopetown, and we love to welcome guests into this area. It's easy to fly in, and there's always something to do, even if the weather isn't perfect. We also love places like Salt Pond on Long Island. There's a bar called Tiny's, and they have laundromats, pizza, Wi-Fi, and rum punches. So we love cruisers locales like that. Of course, you don't want to miss the natural parks in the Bahamas, like the Exuma Land and Sea Park and Conception Island.
Okay, some of the favorite stops, the Boulders is definitely one of them on the island of Virgin Gorda, and it's one of the wonders of the world. Absolutely gorgeous, but it has a challenge. There's only 9 mooring balls, and you cannot anchor in front of it. So you have to use a little strategy where you either go, I like to go very, very early in the morning while my crew is still asleep. I grab a mooring ball and then gradually wake them up and have breakfast and then go snorkeling amongst the boulders. Other places, Trellis Bay, they have a full moon party with dancing and torches and the fireballs. And so you want to use this to look at the calendar beforehand. If you're going to be in the Virgin Islands on a full moon, decide if you want to go to one of the full moon parties and work your itinerary around that. A lot of people over the years have gone to the Bomba Shack, famous for its debauchery, and unfortunately the Bomba Shack did not make it through the last hurricane. Other places to plan, Anegada, beautiful beaches up there with Cowrick Beach, Loblolly Beach, Flash of Beauty, but most of all, pick one of the resorts to use for the lobster dinners.
We do have a question about Anegada specifically. Did it come back like the other islands, Jeff is asking, since it's so low?
It's a real good question, and I thought the same thing. So Anegada is only 26 feet above sea level, and it's basically a reef, and a reef I'll mention with 300 wrecks around it, going back to the Spanish galleons. And it came back better than most other places because they're used to it. The buildings are cinder block, and they actually came back quicker than most of the other places. So don't hold back. Go to Anegada and enjoy it and have a great time. Some of the other favorite stops, Foxy's is back. Cane Garden Bay took a little while, took a lot of destruction, and it's back. And I had a joke last year. I was there actually a year ago right now. And some of the beach bars would announce that they're open, and it would be on the internet that they're open. And you show up, and it's 2 barrels, 2 planks, 2 bottles of rum, and they're open. So it's come back. It's in great shape, and don't hold back to go. And I think you'll really enjoy it.
All right, as we are moving toward the close here, Jessica, I'll take over. Matt and Lucy and Mark and Waterway Guide and Navionics all got together and said, here's some resources. Certainly the Navionics charts, both the electronic navigation charts, the ENCs, and the apps, the app that the Navionics has, the Waterway Guide Bahamas and Turks and Caicos Island. You can see our 2019 edition, fresh off the press. And it's got great information for making the crossing, clearing customs. And by the way, we had a big issue with customs this past year, and one of our editors in the Bahamas, Bob Bauer, got together with the government and figured out where all the clearing imports were and got all that straight. So that's listed. Janai Parker, our managing editor, is sitting here with me this evening, attending the webinar. So we included that in the guidebook. That's in there. Right, right. And Matt's working. So in any event, the Waterway Guide is a great asset for preparing your trip to the Bahamas. Certainly the Explorer chart kit, that's Matt and Lucy are fans of that, the paper charts on board. The Waterway Explorer, our web app, get some great information embedded in that at waterwayguide.com. Navigation alerts, full marina listings, just a ton of information around the Bahamas and all of our cruising regions that we publish guidebooks to. The Explorer chart books, we mentioned that. Don't forget the Cruising the British Virgin Islands. That's Mark's book. He's co-author of that book, and that's a new one, don't you? Didn't you just come off the press with a new version, Mark?
No, I wish it was off the press. We're working on it now, and that'll be the 3rd edition, and it should be available in January.
Oh, well, so we're close. Good. All right, good enough. And then a couple of other books, Gentleman's Guide to Passages South, and Chris Parker Marine Weather Center. So those are some of your resources as you get ready to take your trip south. So in any event, we want to thank our sponsors, Smart Plug, Ranger Tugs, Cutwater Boats, On-Spot Wi-Fi, Navionics, Waterway Guide. And Jessica, I'll turn it over to you to answer any questions or start moving us toward the close.
Yep, thank you so much, and thank you again to the sponsors, the Waterway Guide and to Navionics, for the support on this webinar. We do have a lot of questions outstanding. We have a few minutes to answer questions at the end, and we will not get to all of them by far, but we can try to get to a few of them. One question, Kevin is asking, what are the family islands mentioned? I think, Lucy, you might have mentioned that. Can't hear you.
There you go.
Main islands in the Bahamas are Nassau and Freeport, the main cities in the Bahamas. So anything that's not Nassau or Freeport is a family island.
Thanks for that, Lucy. And we have another question here. Can you talk about extended cruising permit to the Bahamas from William?
Sure. When you enter the Bahamas, you get a 1-year cruising permit for the boat, and you get between a 90-day and 6-month visa for yourself. If you want to extend that cruising permit, you visit the customs office, and they should be able to work that out for you. But I believe that if you're there for longer than 1 calendar year, you may have to pay duty on the vessel. So you'll have to research that one carefully.
Then we have another question from Jeff. If we bring a cat, the actual animal, not the catamaran, that will not go off the boat, are the importing requirements the same as if the animal were actually going to go onto land in the Bahamas, I'm assuming?
Sure. I'm not actually sure about the answer to that. In most places, if the animal doesn't leave the boat, you're not required to get the permits. But I'd be careful in the Bahamas. They are now boarding the boat when you check in. So I'd be hesitant to do that. And also, you're going to be there for a very long time. It's not like the other islands where you're going to pass through for a few days and then move on.
The process is very easy, so it might be worthwhile to do it just in case, or you could call the Bahamian authorities and they would let you know.
Yeah, we also took our dog to the Bahamas, and I would suggest the same thing. I would jump through all the hoops because it's just not something you want to tangle with.
And while we're talking about this, I did recently learn that there's now an agent in Nassau that will handle it for you. I believe his name's Wellington. He has a website. I haven't used him personally, can't recommend with firsthand experience, but I hear good things, and the whole concept is he does it all for you. You just send him the $15 or whatever it is. He walks over to the office, gets the paperwork, and sends it to you. So it might be a little more streamlined.
Great business, wow. And Dot is wondering, are resources available to perform major fixes or repairs in Nanny Key or Tortola?
Yes, Nanny Key and Tortola both have extensive chandleries. There is a yard in Nanny Key that you can use and do. I believe you can do some do-it-yourself repairs there. That's all been repaired. Nanny Key was destroyed pretty badly. In fact, at the beginning of the presentation, those pictures were from one of them with the upside-down cat was Nanny Key. So there's a lot of good resources there, and you'd be just fine in Nanny Key right now.
Okay, another good question is, can you bring foods like coffee beans and trail mixes if you fly into the Bahamas? I'm wondering if customs will let food in. Scott.
I think it just depends on who your customs agent is. I've heard reports of people having great success with bringing all sorts of things in, and I've heard reports of people being stopped and not being able to take what they want in or having to pay duties, but I don't know that there's a firm answer on that.
Okay, thanks. And are there still sunken boats in the mooring fields in the BVIs from Dot?
I'm sorry, are there what in the mooring field? Say, repeat.
Any sunken boats still?
They've pretty much cleaned up most of the sunken boats, and I'm told only a few. So I wouldn't be concerned about the major mooring fields. I will tell you the bitter end still has their mooring balls taped off. They don't want anybody using that mooring field. You can go right next door to Saba Rock and use their mooring balls. So, but surprisingly, most of the mooring balls survive completely intact, and were there a year ago when I was cruising through there.
Okay, good to know. And do the Bahamas offer pump out services, Rich?
That's a great question.
They do not.
Yeah, there are no pump out services in the Bahamas. The best thing to do is a 3-mile cruise.
There are a few marinas in the bigger towns that do have it. I have no experience, I can't talk to that, but I've heard reports that they seldom work.
Okay, all good answers. Well, we are running out of time. We have lots and lots of questions still left. So we'll answer your questions via email between all of us. We will get to them eventually. Please be patient. Thank you everyone so much for joining. It was really fun. It was great to see everybody. And thank you so much to Waterway Guide and all of you that have helped with the hosting tonight. Great information. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you, Mark. See you, Matt. Lucy, we'll talk soon. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you guys.